A commutation by former President Biden was celebrated by activists and the corporate media. However, a former FBI agent shares more of the real story behind Leonard Peltier and the execution of two FBI agents on a South Dakota Indian reservation. Next. Edward Woods is a retired FBI agent who has been involved in the case of convicted killer Leonard Peltier for decades now. But Ed, thank you for joining me. Good to see you.
Thank you.
It was back in 1975, FBI agents Jack Kohler and Ron Williams were murdered on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. In 1977, Leonard Peltier was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison for their murders, agents Kohler and Williams. But after nearly 49 years, former President Biden commuted Peltier's life sentences. He was freed just last week. And as a former FBI agent, what has this been like for you to watch and to see this all unfold?
Well, it's been difficult, and I've been involved for 24 years. All this started when I just happened to meet Jack Kohler's youngest son. He had 2 sons, they were 3 and 5, and I met his youngest son just coincidentally. We both had aviation backgrounds, and we didn't even talk about Peltier, but I did learn that Peltier at that point was up for a parole hearing. And that night I got on the internet and was stunned about everything that was out there, talking about Leonard Peltier, a political prisoner. And there were about 125 references. I downloaded the main Leonard Peltier Defense Committee website, read through it all. They made recommendations to read the book In the Spirit of Crazy Horse by Peter Matheson. So I got the book, and you could see I've been through it a few times. I got Peltier's book and Robert Redford's film. They called it a documentary, but it was just a screenplay of the book. And then I started comparing what they were saying in different places. And then I started downloading the trial transcript. I read through that, took a whole week off, as a matter of fact, and the court decisions, and none of it made any sense. They were just contradicting the actual record. I started writing. As it turned out, my next door neighbor was a webmaster, and 27 days later, on April 30th, 2000, I launched the No Parole Peltier website.
Yeah, I really encourage people to go to that website. It is incredible, the amount of research you've done over the years. But let's start there. Walk us through what really happened that day in 1975. I think many people don't even know that frankly, that's left out of a lot of stories, I'll be honest, and recent stories at that. But what were Agents Kohler and Williams doing on the reservation?
There was an incident on the reservation. I won't go into a whole lot of details, but I did interview several years ago the victim. So Jack Kohler and Ron Williams were out looking for a fugitive named Jimmy Eagle. He was last seen in the Oglala area driving what they believe was a red vehicle. So they were going on Highway 18, and they spotted a vehicle. They turned onto what turned out to be the Jumping Bull property. And they got caught out in the middle of a field. And this is a very touchy subject about the unprovoked attack. There was an eyewitness. The eyewitness was Ron Williams. He was on the radio when Jack Kohler and Ron Williams were in separate vehicles. And the vehicle that they followed, they were getting out with rifles. So Ron was on the radio. There were agents and Bureau of Indian Affairs officers who were listening to the transmissions. He said he was trying to describe where they were. He wasn't really quite sure. And he said, they're getting out of the vehicle. It looks like we're going to be taking fire. They can hear the shots over the radio. And the last part of the transmission was, I'm hit. That was Ron. And he went down. He was shot 3 times. Jack Kohler, and they weren't prepared for this, but Jack Kohler went to the trunk of his vehicle to get out his 308 rifle, And at that point, a what we think was a 44 Magnum round came through the trunk lid and nearly tore his arm off. So he went down, probably going into shock. Ron, wounded 3 times, took his shirt off, crawled over to Jack, and used his shirt as a tourniquet. They waited there. Then Leonard Peltier, Bob Robideau, and Dino Butler, the 3 older Indians of the American Indian. What happened? I'm sorry. While this, when the shooting started, other AIM members from the camp along White Clay Creek came back up to where the agents were and caught them in a crossfire. At one point, there were 114 shell casings that were matched with Leonard Peltier's AR-15. So in any event, the 3 of them go up to Kohler and Williams, who are severely wounded. We think Jack Kohler was probably unconscious from his severe wound, but we know Ron Williams was alive. And there was a later testimony in a later trial that Leonard Peltier made the statement that, I won't say what he said, was begging for his life, but I shot him anyway. Ron held his hand up and his fingers were blown through the back of his head. Jack Kohler was probably unconscious. They shot him once in the top of the head, once in the jaw, and blew his jaw off. So then one thing I have on my desk here, and that as a constant reminder, is the crime scene photograph. I was really reluctant to put it on the website, but eventually I did. So here you have Jack Kohler and Ron Williams laying face down after they've been shot in the face. All right. They were shot in the face and now they're laying right down. So the bodies were manhandled after death. And in Indian law, if you roll over a vanquished enemy to face the ground, they won't meet the creator in the afterlife. So that add insult to injury. Another thing, there are a couple other things that happened here. There were 3 shots fired, one at Ron and 2 at Jack. They picked up the other 2 shell casings, but one of the shell casings was ejected into the trunk. And that became a very important piece of evidence later on. So this is just a constant reminder. This is also where Joe Stunts was at the scene where the agents are dead at their feet. When he takes out Jack Kohler's FBI raid jacket, puts it on, and gives Leonard Peltier a smile. That's a direct quote from Peter Matheson in that book.
Yeah, it's so disturbing to hear the actual details of what took place that go unreported. And even though Peltier was convicted, ultimately there's also a manhunt for Peltier. I know there's a lot more to get into, but he ultimately convicted for murdering these 2 FBI agents. We now have politicians in Minnesota, like Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan and Senator Tina Smith. They're celebrating his release on social media. Local Minnesota media and mainstream media outlets also celebrated the story. I just wanted to highlight a line here from an article from PBS. For nearly half a century, Peltier's imprisonment has symbolized systemic injustice for Native Americans across the country who believe in his innocence. The decision to release the 80-year-old to home confinement was celebrated by supporters, saying he represents every person who's been roughed up by a cop, profiled, had their children harassed at school. This is according to one professor. But what have you made of this coverage and the slant to this story when it comes to the actual facts here, Ed?
There are 2 things. You either buy into the facts or you buy into the myth and the folklore. And that's what they're doing. And I certainly appreciate the way Native Americans were treated way back when. But this is a purely criminal act. An important point. There was no doubt on the reservation and probably on every reservation that white guys in civilian clothes driving late model cars with antennas were the feds. So it was no mystery that the agents were coming on to Jumping Bull for some reason. Coincidentally, one of the young fellas was stopped by Ron Williams and Jack Kohler the night before, thinking that he was Jimmy Eagle, the guy they were looking for.
Hmm.
They went down to um, the Bureau of Indian Affairs office, verified that it wasn't Jimmy Eagle, and one of the officers took him back to the Jumping Bull property. Um, but for the most part, it's the emotion. They're making, much too much over um, the fact. Here's an important point. If this happened in Detroit and the killer's name was Joe Smith, nobody would really care. It would be all over. It'd be history. And I did a very long blog about agents that were killed in the line of duty, and the killers were forgotten in history. Only but for the fact that this happened on a reservation, and Peltier's a Native American. That's the only difference here. Other than that, it's strictly and still is a purely criminal matter. You mentioned that he got consecutive life sentences. He also had another 7 consecutive years for an armed escape from Lompoc Penitentiary, where there were guns outside the prison walls, and they shot um, at the guards.
Former FBI Director Christopher Wray called Peltier a remorseless killer in a private letter to Biden. Given the brutal nature of the murders you've talked about, what kind of message has this sent, do you think, to the brave men and women who work in the FBI?
It's not just the FBI, it's law enforcement. Every cop, every investigator, every detective that goes out there puts his life on the line to help enforce the laws, protect the population. They all feel that. And over the past 24 years that I've been involved with it, I've gotten a lot of really sincere emails from police officers around the country.
Why has this been so important for you, really becoming a personal mission in a way?
When I first saw this photograph, and then when I met Jack Kohler's youngest son, um, I didn't think that they had been forgotten, but I wanted to. One of the main goals of the No Parole Peltier Association and the whole process was to keep their memory alive. Many agents were killed in the line of duty, along with, like police officers and everything. But this killing was so brutal that it had to be emphasized. And that's why I spent so much time going into the hundreds of pages of trial testimony, hundreds of pages of the court records to know exactly what happened and what the real truth is. Setting the emotion, I understand the emotional part of it, but that's irrelevant to what happened at Jumping Bull that day.
You can learn more about this case and see more of Ed's research over the years. Again, it's noparolepeltier.com. But Ed Woods, good to see you again. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your service as well.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
That will do it for this episode of Liz Collin Reports. We will see you next time.